There we go. All right, our guest today is James Gagliano. He worked for the FBI for 25 years. He's a law enforcement analyst for CNN and an adjunct assistant professor in Homeland Security and Criminal Justice at St. John's University. He is also a member of the board of directors of the Law Enforcement Legal Defense Fund. You can follow him on Twitter at James A. Gagliano, and out with a brand new piece in the Washington Examiner that was very provocative, saying that Michael Flynn was railroaded. Wow. James Gagliano, welcome back to the news.
Maddie, it is good to join you. I haven't seen you in a while, at least in person or in the green room. I know our paths haven't crossed in a while, but it's good to join you. And certainly this is a topic I think that you and I are going to love to get into.
Absolutely. Well, let's start with, I want to talk just a little bit about you to establish, because I think your bona fides for writing this column are really unique, because not only do you obviously have the FBI credentials, having having retired after 25 years, but you have been someone who has not been a Trump partisan or a Trump fan. And so for you to have kind of come around to this point, I mean, let me start with that. Talk about that evolution a little bit.
Sure. So, the FBI has been around for 112 years, right? It was started in 1908, but there have only been 8 FBI directors. And obviously, since J. Edgar Hoover chewed up, almost 5 decades, 48 years, there have only been 8 congressionally approved directors. Matt, I served under 4 of them. James Comey was the last director that I served under when I left the FBI after 25 years on January 1st of 2016. And look, I was a guy that, I don't want to say I was in the Comey fan club, but I thought he was a decent FBI director. He served for 3 years, 8 months, and 5 days. I disagreed with some of his policies, but I disagreed with Director Mueller's and Director Freeze and Director Sessions. That's just the normal course of being an agent and always chafing about something. You talk about the fact that I've kind of had an epiphany. I think to be an FBI agent, to be a decent FBI agent, you have to be imbued with a certain sense of cautious skepticism. So when people were frothing at the mouth about the president, the candidate at the time, being a Russian asset, I was the guy that pumped the brakes and I said, hey, let's wait till the facts come in. Let's not get ahead of ourselves. But I was also fiercely defensive of the Comey team. And because I knew a number of them, Andy McCabe worked for me back in the early 2000s when I was a SWAT team leader in the FBI's New York office. He was a young SWAT agent. I knew Bill Priestap. And again, I'd had meetings with James Comey. I can't suggest that I knew him well. But I've always believed in giving people, especially agents and law enforcement officers, the benefit of the doubt. And Matt, I think it goes back to that old aphorism that I'm a big-time adherent to, which is Hanlon's razor. Never attribute to malice that which can be adequately summed up by stupidity or incompetence. And look, I've done dumb things. And so I looked at all the things that were coming in, the struck page texts, all the different things, obviously Crossfire Hurricane and mid-year exam, which was the investigation into the Clinton email investigation. And I just chalked it up to decent people making mistakes. Now, I'm not willing to make a complete counter 180 and say that the FBI writ large has been compromised. It's part of the deep state. It's a huge cabal. But Matt, the more information that comes out, and obviously with this last trove of discovery materials or Brady material that was released to Sidney Powell, who's representing General Flynn, Matt, I've come around on that. I do think that there were a few people, a few senior executives and mid-level executives that were out to put their fingers on the scale and let partisan political bias infect their decision-making.
So I'm going to ask you a little bit. So the case in question, the latest, right, is that so going all the way back to the first weeks of the Trump presidency, Michael Flynn is then the national security advisor, and he's not on the job very long. He's apparently called into a meeting with the FBI. He thinks that this is like an informal meeting, like not that they're not interrogating him or questioning him. He's not the target of this, right? He's talking to colleagues. He's a bigwig. They're bigwigs. And And so I guess there was some documentation that came out that implied that they were attempting to get him to lie. First question for you: do you believe that that lying to the FBI should be in and of itself a crime?
So you're asking a retired FBI agent if he thinks that a tool should be taken out of our toolbox? Absolutely should not be removed. Of course, I believe that lying to a federal agent, which is essentially lying to the government, lying to either the executive, legislative, or judicial branch. If you lie in front of Congress, it's the same thing. If you lie to an FBI agent, the same thing. Do I believe it's appropriate? Matt, I do. And I think it's also important to make this distinction here too, that, this isn't a conduct of official duties, and there is no obligation for the FBI or anybody else to remind someone or to coach someone and say, hey, if you lie, this is something that you could be facing a felony for, up to 5 years in prison, because the old saying, ignorance of the law is no excuse. Now, there are some people on the other side that argue and think that this is too obtrusive by the government, it's unfair. I respect those arguments, but as a retired FBI agent, no, it certainly was something that I was never able to get the Southern District in New York or the Eastern District in New York to charge, but it was always something as leverage that you could always say to somebody, hey, if you're not forthright with me, you recognize that lying to a federal agent exposes you to a felony. So that's how I used it in the conduct of my investigations, but I was never able to get the districts in New York to ever charge that as a crime.
It just seems to me like, and again, you have much more expertise than me, but from potentially looking at it from Michael Flynn's standpoint, I mean, if you go into a courtroom or even into Congress, you may be like sworn in, right? And so like, obviously, that you're under oath and that carries. If you just happen to be talking to an FBI agent, and should they at least say, let me be clear, this is official business? Like, what if I lie to an FBI agent? I don't even know he's an FBI agent. Is that
It has to be material to the investigation of a crime. So if you walk up to an FBI agent on the street and the FBI agent says, is it raining? And you say, no, the sun is shining, and meanwhile you're in a tsunami, that is not lying to the FBI. It is in the conduct of a lawfully predicated investigation. Now, I understand the civil liberties argument there. I understand you're raising very, very good arguments for people that say, hey, look, maybe we need to revisit that. Again, 25 years, quarter century in the FBI, I was never able to get the districts in New York, which are the two most powerful districts in the country, in my estimation, and many others, to charge it, because their arguments always were, hey, get them on the substantive crime. Don't try to use that just as arm twisting, to your point.
And speaking of arm twisting, is it legit what if Donald Trump is my target or somebody else is my target? Would it be okay for me to try to get, ethical, appropriate, normal for me to try to get someone like Flynn to lie? Then all of a sudden I could use them to cut a deal. The verbiage much better than I do. Is that appropriate or normal, or would that be seen as inappropriate and unethical?
The latter. You're never, ever going to use that to try to twist somebody into a position. You use the term perjury trap. And I try to stay away from that term because I think it gets overused. People constantly overuse perjury trap and entrapment. This wasn't entrapment with Lieutenant General retired Flynn. Entrapment is where you put something in somebody's mind that is not otherwise predisposed to commit a crime, and you convince them to do it as an armed instrument of the state. So I go to some innocent person on the street and I say, I have a load of cocaine and I want you to help me sell it, and I'm going to cut a deal with you. You get 50% of it. If that person doesn't have a prior history of that, if that person wasn't inclined to do so without the government introduction of that, that is entrapment.
So if if an FBI agent had gone to Flynn and said, why don't you call Ambassador Kislyak and start negotiating now? You're going to be there, and you're going to be the national security advisor in a week anyway. That would have been entrapment.
100%. So you see this misnomer and this mischaracterization of people arguing entrapment. It's not entrapment. The perjury trap piece is a little bit more difficult now to counter because of the FBI notes that you referenced at the top of this, Matt. That makes it more difficult. I don't think that's what they were going in there to do. I made the argument in my piece at the Examiner that I know Bill Priestap. I think he was trying to memorialize these conversations, and I don't think he was 100% comfortable with sending agents to the White House to do that. But I don't believe it was a perjury trap. I believe they were going there to see if they could somehow get him to help them get to Trump. Is there something wrong with that? No, but there's also processes and protocols that the FBI at the senior levels have to follow. And in this instance, they should have gone through the Department of Justice, but they didn't. They should have also gone through White House counsel, who I believe at the time was Don McGahn. They didn't. Or they should have gone to the White House Chief of Staff. But James Comey, in subsequent interviews over the last year or so, has almost smugly gloated that he knew that there was consternation at the White House. He knew that there was all the turmoil and chaos of a new team coming in and getting set up. And so he knew that was the opportune time to send people over, and then had the deputy director, the aforementioned Andy McCabe, reach out to the general privately, assuage his feelings, convince him he didn't need an attorney, that these are just, national security folks talking to a national security folk. And for that reason, is it illegal, Matt? No. Are these people going to be indicted? No. Is it good form? And is it what we should be doing as the FBI? No.
So you said earlier that this isn't the deep state. Well, and I don't like Trump, right? And we'll throw that out there. But Trump always said they were kind of out to get him. And it does seem like very powerful people in the governmental bureaucracy and the intel community and the law enforcement communities were very early trying to take him down. Now, maybe they legitimately believed that he had been working with Russia. Let me ask that question. Do you think that they believed? In fact, if you read the Mueller report, some of the stuff Trump did was not great. Do you think that they had the noble intentions, or is this something we should be worried about as citizens? We elected a guy, duly elected him, and right away they're kind of trying to take him out.
Yeah, this is going to be kind of funny because, as you know, I've been harshly critical of James Comey for good reason, I believe. But James Comey nailed it early on when he described what happened in 2016 and 2017, where you had the Hillary Clinton email investigation, and then followed by the Russian, the Trump Kremlin collusion case, two different FBI cases. And he described that as a 500-year flood, Matt. I mean, just for those two things to happen at the same time, I mean, you can go back generations, and I'm sure people are going to argue and say, well, this case was consequential and this other incident was consequential. But for our time, for modern times, those two cases, it was a 500-year flood. Now, when that happens, you want to fall back on established protocols and processes. Those are the guardrails. We constantly talk about the guardrails that Donald Trump goes outside of or attempts to go outside of. The FBI can't do the same. And what I think happened here was a small coterie of senior executives, many of them, and I've used this term often on the air, were callow, inexperienced folks that had moved up the ladder very quickly, had not spent time in the field, enough time to learn how investigations work, that were involved in both cases. It is unconscionable to me that you have this small circle that was handling both cases, instead of one case being handled out of the New York field office with headquarters oversight, the other being handled out of the Washington metropolitan field office with headquarters oversight. So, Matt, what I think happened, again, I'm trying to stay away from most of the people putting him into that sinister, insidious, nefarious, deep state cabal plot. Most of the people became victims of confirmation bias. So if one person said, this is what it is, and if that was James Comey or Andy McCabe, the rest of the investigators set about to prove that right. That's not how investigations work. Now, were there bad apples? Yeah. Kevin Kleinsmith was a Department of Justice attorney who literally altered an email that was being sent to the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, the FISC, where the judges sit to determine whether or not the Carter Page FISA application should go through, and lied on it, said that they had not received information that they had received information on. That's Mr. Viva la Resistance. That's criminal. So that's a bad actor. Now, were the Peter Strzok's and the Lisa Pages and the Annie McCabe's and even the Bill Priestaps, who I have affinity and affection for, were they guilty of the same? I would argue that they were in this tiny little vacuum, this decision vacuum, and they worked from a conclusion backwards as opposed to working from, hey, here's what's predicating the investigation. Now let's work towards where the evidence takes us. And that's where I think that confirmation bias came in.
So for those who are listening, we're having a Zoom conversation, and soon I'm going to throw it open, and I'll just invite people in kind of one at a time and ask questions and have a conversation. And if you're listening to this and you want to be part of these, we've had a whole bunch of cool people. We just had Ramesh Panuro on, David Fromm. It's been great. You can help, support long form content. Go to patreon.com/Matt Lewis, and you will be invited on these calls. And we don't even post all these on podcasts, so you're missing some good stuff. So definitely check that out. James, a couple quick questions before I turn it over, though. I want to talk about Mike Flynn a little bit. You said he was railroaded, maybe. This is a guy, though, who was head of the Defense Intelligence Agency, so he should have been competent, and yet he was going to Trump rallies saying, lock her up. This is a guy, I don't know if it's true, but apparently not only did he not fill out his FISA reports, but he was apparently working with Erdogan in Turkey and some scheme to kidnap Gulen and basically remove him from the country, extirpate. What's the word I'm looking for?
Expatriate.
Anyway, that seems really shady to me. Was Michael Flynn and here's the other thing too, is the Logan Act. Everybody talks about, the Logan Act, it's never been used. It's some obscure, thing, and it shouldn't have been a big deal. I don't know. I feel like it's a good idea to discourage people who are not currently in office from representing the United States abroad. Was Michael Flynn, an innocent victim here? How do you feel about him?
Sure. So let me say this first. I think Michael Flynn, to reach the rank of lieutenant general, to have the positions that he had, I believe good people can make mistakes and do bad things. That was my argument up front about the FBI folks that I talked about. Good people can make bad choices. We understand that. Look, the stuff where he morphed into a political surrogate and the locker up chance, is that beneath what a retired lieutenant general should be doing and somebody who's going to be appointed the NSA should be doing? I will 100% agree with you there. But again, we're all equal under the eyes of our system of criminal justice, or under our justice system. And what I found discomforting here was how the FBI went at him. And again, that's the crux of my argument. If they handled the Hillary Clinton email investigation the same way as they handled the Michael Flynn and the Trump-Russia collusion case writ large the same way, Matt, I wouldn't have any problems. I'd sit there and I would argue one way or the other that they were too soft or too hard. But the fact that they're so starkly different is what unsettling to me. Now, the points that you just made about what you can argue the general was guilty of. If we're going to, and I know this is a popular conservative talking point, the Logan Act has been around since 1799. It's been charged twice. There's never been a conviction. The last time was in 1850. And if we were really to go after Logan Act violations, we should set up an FBI office on K Street and just start taking pictures and interviewing people. So, and I'm not trying to be flippant, because look, lying to the FBI is a crime. Process crimes are crimes. And yes, the Logan Act is still in the book. The same thing with FARA, F-A-R-A, which is, your requirement to register as a foreign agent. Was it good judgment a good idea for someone who is going to be tapped as the NSA to have these relationships and not fully disclose them? Oh, hell no, it wasn't. That is utterly, it's stupefying to me. Now, having said that, the FBI was never going to charge either of those two things. Robert Mueller, the special counsel, did not charge any of those two things. So having said that, what was the point of Peter Strzok and Joseph Pientka, the two agents that Annie McCabe and James Comey sent to the White House 4 days after the inauguration? What was the point? They had the transcripts of the Flynn-Kislyak call. They knew everything that happened on there, and they know that there was no collusion on there. Were there things on there that somebody could admonish them for because they talked about sanctions? And yes, the incoming administration shouldn't have talked about that when there's still another administration that's in charge. You can argue that, and I'm not trying to use whataboutism. It happens every time we have an orderly change of power. But what was the point? And so that's the argument that people make, which it's hard to refute, that if you weren't trying to get him to lie, which is what Bill Priestap put in his notes, if that wasn't the investigative goal, and it wasn't to get him fired, which were also in those investigative notes, two things the FBI should never set out to do. Matt, what was the goal of the interview?
I have a lot of questions. I'd love to talk to you about Christopher Wray and hear more about Comey, but I'm going to end my little part here, the intro, by just sort of asking you to end where we began, which is I'd love to hear you. You look back at the last several years of your writing and your analysis as it pertains to, this investigation. Where do you think you were wrong? Where do you think you were right? And what have you learned?
Well, I think you and I kind of come at this the same way. So, I'm former law enforcement. I would say that, law enforcement is not a monolith. We're not a monolith of ideas or political ideologies. It's certainly not as conservative as it used to be, but I think it's safe to say law enforcement is a relatively conservative bastion. So I consider myself to be a proud conservative. I did not vote for Donald Trump. I was not a Donald Trump fan when he was running. I was not a Donald Trump fan when he got elected. However, once he was elected, if I was serving in the administration or I was still in the FBI, I would be required to take my orders from the executive branch, just like I did under President Obama, just like I did under President Bush 43, just like I did under President Clinton, just like I did under President Bush 41, and just like I did under President Reagan when I was in the service. So that's number one. As things have changed and we've moved along the continuum from the election in 2016 to where we are now, are there things that have disgusted me and troubled me? I've heard you write about them and speak passionately about it. I've agreed. I've written some things. I think I referred to the president as acting like a mob boss one time in a piece that I wrote for the Washington Examiner. I am troubled by some of the things he's done. And when I get pushback from people that say, why are you being so harshly critical of the investigators? Why are you being so harshly critical of the FBI? And I say, because there's a mechanism in place to remove a president. There's the ballot box. And if you can't wait 4 years, there's impeachment. And they tried that. And if it's something that goes beyond that, there's the 25th Amendment. There are mechanisms in place for that. My job is to write about something that I know inside and out because I served in so many different positions. I successfully avoided being at headquarters, but I served in every possible capacity that you could in the FBI, from undercover to tactical response to senior level to mid-level to supervisory level to brick agent. So my passion on this is when I defended James Comey and I defended the FBI, the James Comey FBI, so passionately on May 10th, the day after James Comey was fired in 2017, as more and more details have come out, Matt, it's changed my opinion. And I look at it and say, I know that you've evolved in your positions on Trump and the Republican Party. I certainly have evolved on the political, spectrum, and I've evolved here too. So people that look at me and say, well, weren't you defending Comey and weren't you defending? But as facts emerge, we expect sober adults to look at them, evaluate them, and then change their positions where appropriate. And I think that's where I've come. So do I think that there's a deep state? No. Do I think that there were some huge mistakes made by a small group of people, some of them good people that were just being led and should have stood up and didn't, and some bad people. And the answer to that is absolutely yes.
All right, I lied. I have one more question.
Okay.
Who is there a villain? Is there one or two people that you would specifically call out as bad actors?
So this one doesn't pain me. I'll give you one that pains me and one that doesn't pain me. It doesn't pain me to be critical of James Comey. I think he's a narcissist of the highest order. We have one in the Oval Office right now, and we have a competing one that he fired on May 10th or May 9th of 2017. What disgusts me so much about the former director, and I know that's a tough word to use, and people are going to say, well, you're unhinged because you're using that kind of language. But what disgusts me is the fact that he is a 6'8" head of the premier law enforcement agency in the world. He leads 36,000 people, 12,000 armed FBI agents. And when he has 9 separate meetings with the president, which left him feeling, quote unquote, queasy and uncomfortable, instead of pushing back and challenging the president at that time, he instead writes copious notes, waits until he's fired, and then takes those notes, doesn't even leak them himself, but leaks them through a surrogate to the New York Times. When I was in the FBI, people that did what he did, he would have seen that they were fired, that the Office of Professional Responsibility and the IG would have seen them fired and referred for criminal charges. That's unsettling to me. He didn't push back on Loretta Lynch when she tried to put her finger on the scales and call the Clinton investigation a matter. I want more from my FBI director. So I stopped defending him when I started hearing him testify. Then he writes the book and he goes on that vainglorious 80 or 90 different whistle stop tour, selling the book. And the more and more he spoke, Matt, the more uncomfortable and unsettled I and many retired FBI agents like me that had originally defended him became less of a fan. So when you say, is there someone guilty? I charge Comey with his post-bureau conduct, actually his post-Trump administration conduct. I do. There's another one that's harder for me to say that, and that's Andy McCabe. Andy McCabe lied 4 times, 3 times under oath. And as I said on CNN before Andy became a colleague there, if you're the deputy director 2 days away from retirement and a cushy pension, or you're a brand new street agent with 2 days on the job straight out of Quantico, and you lie, bye. And that's exactly what I said. And so for someone who did that, not once, not twice, not 3 times, but 4 times, 3 of those times under oath, and then to come back months later and say that there was so much chaos going on, he just didn't know if he had his story straight, when it involved leaking information to the Washington Post that wasn't to assist the FBI, which the deputy director is allowed to do, but was to assist him in his reputation. It doesn't look good. And then lastly is Strzok and Page. And I think those were 2 young, super ambitious. We call them on the job blue flamers, meaning they were desperate. If you read, I read every single page of the Inspector General's 434-page report on Crossfire Hurricane 2 or 3 times. And I read every single one of the released text message exchanges between Strzok and Page. So I know the tempo, I know how they talk, I know the jargon, I know the acronyms. I can even fill in the redactions in many, many places. And I was disgusted to see what their focus was. And yes, I do believe that they attempted to put their fingers on the scale. So if you say there's any people that I blame, those 4, it's hard not to. I'm not breaking new ground here on your podcast, but those are the 4 I think that I would hold the most culpable, Matt.
Awesome, man. Well, let me just say, first of all, I'm glad I asked that last question. That was really good. And also just thank you again, man, for being here. And we've just... one of the blessings of getting to do TV has been getting to meet and know people like you and hang out. So I appreciate you being here. So I'm going to bring in what, according to my Zoom, tells me is in chronological order. I have David Petrusha. I didn't see you pop up first, but
I think Jonathan was there first.
I thought so too. Okay. Do you mind if I'll go to Jonathan first?
I yield to my colleague.
You must just have the David Petrusha seat.
My question was actually answered over the course of the talks. So if you want, you can go to David.
Okay. And then feel free to hop in. We'll just, have a conversation, but back to you, David.
My question, I guess, is tangential, well, bit related, but not to Flynn. We keep talking about lying to the FBI, lying to the FBI. We've heard that for quite a while now, even to us laymen. And is it illegal to lie to a cop, to a law enforcement official? I mean, I never hear of an indictment. Like, you know, you talk to Officer Krupke and said, "Gee, Officer Krupke," and lied about all the things in the song. So, is that fall into the same category, or is it state by state?
Well, David, if I can call you by your first name, first of all, the fact that you referenced West Side Story, you are now my number one hero. So,
Okay.
Officer Krupke, that's a great reference.
Okay.
Great question. And here's the answer to that. If you lie to a police officer, are you still facing the same exposure you would under Title 18 United States Code Section 1001, which is the equivalent of lying to an FBI agent? The answer is no. And here's why. Because I said at the top, you're not essentially lying to the FBI. You're lying to the executive, legislative, or judicial branch of the United States of America. So police officers, they're armed instruments of the state, and again, of the small s and the big S. So they don't actually work for the U.S. government. So Title 18, United States Code, Section 1001, which they charged George Papadopoulos and General Flynn with, was lying to the FBI, essentially lying to the executive branch. So yes, I don't want to put this out on the street, but you can lie to a cop and you won't be charged for it.
Okay, there's no state statutes that you know of.
Not that I know of. I mean, cops get lied to all the time, as do FBI agents, but cops can't hold over a potential subject or a target of an investigation. Hey, if you lie to me, I'm going to jam you up and you're going to face 5 years in a federal pen. That is only on the federal side.
Okay, gotcha.
Stephen Klaus.
Hey, Matt.
Hey, how's it going, man?
Good. Thanks for letting me be a part of this today. This is a challenging situation, and let me say I'm near to my brother-in-law, Lieutenant Colonel, the U.S. Army retired, worked with Flynn overseas, also at the Defense Intelligence Agency. So he sent me a couple questions, and he wants me to ask you about a Robin Gritz. You know her? He says she's pretty instrumental part of this, not being talked very much about. His second question is, what is meant by possession of the Flynn-Kislyak transcript? So those are just a couple things. He's in fairly close contact with Flynn all the time. And so I will confess I like Flynn. I've gone to hockey games with him. But I think, he's a military guy, and then he came out of the military and he's trying to figure things out. I don't think he maybe handled that quite as well as he should have.
Stephen, before we go to James,
yeah.
Tell me about him what's Mike Flynn like hanging out with at a Caps game?
He was a blast. He was absolutely a hoot, And so I've been fond of him, and I talked with him right after Trump was elected, literally the Saturday after he was elected. And he told me about traveling with Trump, being in the plane, and how obsessed Trump was with media coverage and media exposure. And he said he was just brilliant from the social media side. And there's a lot of stories he told me about that. And so I think he got caught up in all of that. He's really not, I know his partisan stripe. I don't want to go down into that. And I know that from my brother-in-law and other things. But, I think he's a patriot. I think he loves his country. He's paid a huge price being gone from his family so much. And just to kind of put it, he's been gone, guys, like decades. And so when the FBI did this thing, he put him under a pretty heavy squeeze as it relates to his son. Matt, I heard you mention about the Turkey thing. I have some inside knowledge of that. Just a poor business decision. It was a documentary video that was being made. He didn't even know hardly anything about it. But his name brand was so high. He made poor association choices in a couple areas and just didn't have and I think we all can relate to that. So, yeah. But I want to go back to my question. Robin, talk about Robin, talk a little bit about this transcript. And then my brother-in-law, he says, if that actual recording of the FBI flat out broke the law and abused FISA, why is that not tantamount to treason for certain members of the FBI? And he actually thinks that because of the fight, and he's very familiar with the FISA court, that why is there not long-term prison for these people who abuse the FISA court? So there's, gosh, those three heavy questions. So.
And before we go to James, let me say, I just occurred to me, I think I said FISA when I meant FARA earlier.
Yep.
So
okay.
I knew what you were talking about.
We'll fix that
Okay.
in post-editing.
Okay. Awesome. So thank you so much. It's great to have you on this call, and I appreciate your intellectual rigor. And, you know, we all can change our minds as we get, I certainly didn't like Trump as well, and I'm still struggle with the guy. And I work with a lot of good friends, and I know Matt does too. But the policy for what I want, a lot of the policy that I like, I'm getting. Not all, but you know, but it's the style is very unique. So anyhow, yeah.
Well, sir, I think you and I kind of fall along the same lines too. You know, I think he can't get out of his own way. I mean, he steps on great news, and he does things sometimes where you go, wow, you had me there, but you went one bridge too far. So I think I'm in the same boat that you are. And of course, you know, the Democrats are struggling on their side too. So it's going to be interesting to see but Matt didn't have me on to talk politics. But to your point in regards to the general, I have great respect for him. I truly do that. And I've spoken to his brother. I've not spoken to the general personally. And I've spoken to his attorney, Sidney Powell, because I've written extensively about this, because I think he's one guy that really got a raw deal in this. He and Carter Page, I believe, are the two victims of this investigation. And look, you know, we're all humans. And again, I try to chalk a lot of the things that have happened here up to human frailties and mistakes, but there was malfeasance, and we've got to call it out. So in regards to the general, I agree with Matt's point and yours as well. You know, when he left the arena of being a sober voice and you know, showed up at the convention, you know, that didn't help it. The same thing with Rudy Giuliani. I was in New York on 9/11. I remember what a great leader he was. As soon as he became a political surrogate, it ruined everything. But that's neither here nor there. Your mention of Robin Greitz, Gritz,
yes,
Robin Greitz. I do not know her personally. I have communicated with her post bureau only because she's reached out to me when she saw something or read something. What I do know about Robin is that she had a long time butting of heads, if you will, with Andy McCabe and several others at headquarters. And I know the general went to bat for her. I know the general stood up for her, and there was whether it was an IG investigation or there was just personnel investigation stuff related to an OPR, which is for the FBI, the Office of Professional Responsibility is like the police department's IAB, their Internal Affairs Bureau. And I do know that the general spoke up on her behalf, which I don't think helped her cause. And I don't think helped his cause, even though, you know, this is a well-respected guy. But then obviously when he became part of the Trump team or the Trump campaign and obviously the Trump transition team, did that bleed over? I don't know, but I do know that he went to bat for her. I do know a lot of people that respect her and that thought that she got the shaft and respected what he did in going to bat for her. So that's how that all kind of fit together. The second question you asked, if I recall, was about the transcript. Now, I went back.
Whether there's written word for word or actual voice recording, he wanted to know more about that. So
yeah, that's a great question. And so, you know, a few of my friends in the business, and like Matt pointed out, I never would have met a guy like Matt except for the whole CNN thing. And I've got an opportunity to meet some other folks and some of my other friends. Andy McCarthy, who's a former assistant United States attorney who writes for Fox News and a Fox News contributor. And I was speaking to him about this yesterday, and both of us were pouring through Andy McCabe's book and James Comey's book. And there's a very interesting thing in there where they don't describe it as a transcript. I think they call it like the statements that were taken, you know, from the conversation. I forget what kind of tortured prose they use, but Andy's question to me was the same thing. He goes, do you think there wasn't a transcript? Because neither one of them used that exact word. And in law enforcement channels, that's a word that we would use. You know, if you're up on a Title III, which is, you know, if you watch TV, it's a wiretap in a criminal case. You know, you listen to the call and then you transcribe it, and then the transcript becomes something that's used as evidence at trial, right? Same thing on a FISA end. So you do these recordings on a FISA, which is, different standard, but the same thing. You're still doing it over here. And then a transcript is taken from that call, or from that intercept, as we call it. But why didn't they use that term? I don't know the answer to it. And I have no problem saying I don't know. It is something that I am digging into right now, trying to figure out why that word was avoided. So my impression was, when they went to the general, they let him know that they knew what was on the call. He knew that because he said to them, I'm sure you heard the call anyway. So he wasn't duped into thinking that they hadn't heard it. But whether or not they were in possession of a transcript or not, I do not know the answer.
Okay. Excellent. Well, thank you. That's
All right. I see
asked you-
Jonathan.
Yeah.
Jonathan has his hand up.
So while we're on the topic of bashing on James Comey, I would like to just ask about his decision on October 28th to reopen the investigation into Hillary Clinton's emails. Now, full disclosure, I did not support Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton in 2016, but I always thought that the decision was poorly handled, but I wasn't going to say that it was politically motivated. As someone who's familiar with the process, was that decision politically motivated?
Okay, that is in law enforcement, you never want it to collide with politics. And I say this all the time. I worked in the FBI for 25 years in many different offices across many different, I was assigned overseas. I was assigned in Afghanistan, Mexico City. I was on tactical teams. I could not tell you who one person I worked with was going to vote for in any election. And you say, well, that makes no sense. You guys are reasonably smart. You read, you're obviously you're FBI agents, you got college degrees. It was never something that came up. We talked about cases, we talked about family, and we talked about sports. Now, having said that, in headquarters, it's a different animal. So when you're inside the Beltway and you're dealing with legislative affairs and you're dealing with laws like, HR 218 or things that are going to help, crime victims or help FBI families, it's a different animal. And obviously at these levels, here's what happened. James Comey made a decision. And again, it was that same small coterie of individuals. Peter Strzok, Lisa Page, Andy McCabe, Jim Baker, the general counsel for the FBI at the time, and James Comey, in regards to how they were going to handle the Hillary Clinton email decision, which was, we're not going to recommend charges. Because remember, the FBI doesn't make charging decisions. We put an investigation together, we hand it to the Department of Justice across the street, they make the determination whether or not to charge or not. James Comey did something that was so outside of the guardrails. I mean, so just completely, just counter to the way that we do things in the FBI. But I defended him at the time. His argument for stepping in front of those microphones, I believe it was in June of 2016, where he basically exonerated Hillary Clinton. He had that statement because he felt that the Department of Justice, Loretta Lynch, Sally Yates was compromised. He felt that he could not go to them and get a true reading on whether or not the case should be indicted or not. So he didn't tell anybody about it. He didn't notify the White House. He didn't notify the Department of Justice. He just said, I'm giving a press conference. He went out and did it. At the time, I believed it was the right thing to do. I believed in the 500-year flood, and it was the right thing to do. Congress has him in. I believe it was the committee that Trey Gowdy was on or was chairing at the time. They have him in. He talks about it and the decision that they reached, where they took it from reckless disregard to casual indifference, or whatever the word choice that they used, to take it from a violation of a federal statute to a nothing burger. And he's explaining it. And I believe it was Trey Gowdy said to him pointedly at the end, if anything else comes on your radar, you will come back to Congress with it. And he said, yes, sir, I will. I believe that James Comey felt compelled for that reason, and also the reason that when the New York City Police Department took possession of Anthony Weiner's laptop and they were going through all the issues of improper contact with a minor on it, they realized that there was a huge treasure trove of emails on there between Huma Abedin and Hillary Clinton. Some of it that they decided or believed to be classified and not similar to the ones that had already been turned over. Well, Andy McCabe, and this is Bureau lore, was kind of making a decision, should we or should we not? And there, I think, were some threats, and this is in the public domain, from the New York City Police Department or others in the FBI that said, if you don't handle this, if this is not, we are going to leak to the press. Now, I disagree with that tactic, but I think those two things, the promise to Congress and then the threat that it was somehow going to leak to the media, that the FBI was sitting on a treasure trove of new emails that had not been vetted, James Comey felt compelled to get out in front of it and send the letter. He sent the letter. He didn't leak it, but he knew if he sent it to Congress, it'd be leaked 5 seconds later. So that's how that happened. Do I blame him for that? I have a hard time. I blame James Comey for a lot of things. I have a hard time blaming him for that.
Doug, we haven't gotten to you. Any thoughts or questions?
Yeah, a few. I guess the other thing, just apropos of what you were saying about the Comey press conference, I recalled at the time that Loretta Lynch had made the comment that she was going to defer to the FBI anyhow, right, because of her meeting on the plane with Clinton. So it didn't strike me at the time as that big a deal. He already knew that he was going to get deferred to, so he just had a press conference and announced it. That was my reaction to it. Obviously, 6 months later, everyone has a different view, but at the time, it didn't seem like a big deal to me. In fact, it seemed like he was doing kind of the Solomonic thing by, I'm not going to charge her, but I'm going to let everyone know what's out there. I don't know. So I guess I didn't at the time blame him for that, and probably don't now. But my question about Michael Flynn is the following. I had always been somewhat sympathetic to Michael Flynn, just from not knowing a whole lot about it, from reading press reports of this guy who makes a mistake in an interview, is suddenly charged and has his life ruined. And then last week I was listening to a podcast with Sarah Isker and David French, where they made me come to a very different view of it. And here's the case that David French made on that podcast, which was that, yeah, you can make whatever arguments you want to about the interview in the White House, but that really wasn't the important thing. The important thing was more what was going on with Turkey, that he had gotten in, that was not great at all. That was very bad. And so as part of a plea deal, he's not going to plead to that, but he is going to plead to this lie at the White House. And since it's a plea deal, who really cares what happened at the White House? Because he's pleading guilty to it. It's all part of a larger deal to deal with the fact that he's been doing some things he shouldn't be doing. And now all we're focusing on is the crime he pled to, as opposed to all the other crimes that are out there. And that to me was somewhat persuasive, that we're focusing on the wrong thing. And maybe he wasn't railroaded, but you make a good case too. So I'm interested to hear what your response to that is.
Look, first of all, I have just imminent respect for David French. I was on a radio show with him last week and I had to follow him. And you never want to follow a guy like David French because he's so smart, he makes my eyebrows hurt. But he makes a good case. But my argument is this. If you're not going to charge him for violations of FARA or for violations of the Logan Act, what was the purpose of the interview? And here's the thing. The FBI should never, ever, ever, ever be in the business of getting someone at the White House removed unless they're bringing chargeable offenses forward. Like here, Department of Justice, we've just found this out. You need to have this person removed or this person needs to be indicted. It's not their decision to, as Bill Priestap's notes say, what's our goal here? Are we looking to threaten him on the FARA and the Logan Act, or are we looking to see if he's going to lie, or are we just looking to try to get him fired? That's not their job. And I argued with some people on Twitter about it last night, and they're like, but James, you're missing the fact he lied to the vice president. That's a fireable offense, but it's not an offense to go to jail over. And again, the poor judgment, you can argue, and again, I've heard compelling cases on both sides for his relationship with Turkey and whether or not he should have done this or done that, whether or not he should have made the call at that point in time. I for one want my incoming transition team, especially my NSA, to be reaching out and talking to people. I think that's appropriate. But I'm not a political scientist, and I don't work at the White House, and I can understand the arguments that you can only have one team in charge at a time. But having him reach out to find out What are your plans? Are sanctions, are they being escalated? What's the plan here? I don't have a problem with that. What I have a problem with is the FBI's role in all that. If you were never going to charge on the not registering as a foreign agent in that instance, you were never going to charge the Logan Act. We all know that. If you were never going to do that, why would you go see him and circumvent protocols, established protocols for an interview with a senior level White House official? Would you have done that to Hillary Clinton? No. As Trey Gowdy said the other day, when Hillary Clinton was interviewed by the FBI, they sent a letter to her team of attorneys, and he described it. When they went to interview her, there was a medium-sized law firm in the space. The FBI was only allowed to bring 2 people, DOJ 2 people. Here's the list of questions. You've got a week to chew over them. And by the way, make sure you're honest, because if you're not, that is a violation of federal law under 1001. That's a vastly different way that they treated her, a presidential candidate, than they treated Michael Flynn. I have a problem with that.
Wow. This has been great, man. Thank you. Let's plug some stuff. How can people, before I get to the plugging, do you have any, you talked a lot, so I'm sure you probably covered a lot, but was there any last thoughts or anything we should have asked that we did?
No, you guys hit it, and I apologize, because once I start going, and you were probably going, all right, cut it here, cut it there, but I appreciate the opportunity to do something like this, because it's, Matt, as you know from doing TV, you get 20 seconds or 30 seconds and you say things and you can't frame it the right way and you can't nuance it the appropriate way. So an opportunity like this to flesh it out and say, hey, why do you think he was railroaded, other than that title and that soundbite? I appreciate it. But no, you guys, I mean, you brought the A-team in because you asked all the right questions.
I love long form conversation. That's why I started doing podcasting, exactly that. And now I think it's just been enhanced by having smart people who can ask questions that I don't think of. And so it's been even better. How can people who want to keep in touch, read your stuff, follow you on Twitter, anything, how can they do that?
Well, I thought only because this is a recent development, I thought I'd never be the guy to say, I have a website, go to my website. But I actually do have a website, James A. Gagliano. The last name is GAGLIANO.com. And on there, I post content. I post the articles that I write. I do public speaking and things like that. So if you want to learn more, you can go there or follow us. Matt and I are frequent Twitterers, so you can follow me at James A. Galliano at Twitter. So thanks for having me.
I've been saying Gagliano or Gagliano.
Yeah.
No, so this is the crazy thing. And I grew up in the Deep South. You can't tell from my New York accent now, but I grew up in the Deep South. My family is actually off the boat Sicilians that settled in 1905 in Birmingham, Alabama. So the way that our name is pronounced, the second G, the Sicilian way, is you pronounce it like the liqueur, that tall bottle of Galliano. You pronounce it without the second G. But growing up in the Deep South, I answered to just about anything.
You've never corrected me, and I think I'm pretty sure other people have introduced you incorrectly as well.
Well, you know who's the worst is Chris Cuomo, and I looked at him and I'm like, Paisan, if you can't get it right, how can I expect anybody else to?
Awesome. Well, thank you. You've been so generous with your time. James Gagliano, thank you for coming on the news.
Thanks for having me.
Great job. Thank you.
Oh, that was fun. Thanks, everybody.